Good evening. My name is Shin Yi Pai, and I'm the Program Director at Town Hall. On behalf of the staff at Town Hall Seattle and our friends at Elliott Bay Books, it's my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's virtual talk with Martin Williams. As we get underway, I would like to acknowledge our institution stands on the unceded traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continuing use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. We're so glad you've joined us for tonight's virtual program, which will run about 60 minutes, including Q&A. To integrate our in-person and virtual audience experiences, we've changed the Q&A platform this year. To submit your question, please enter meet.ps/mwilliams or scan the QR code right now on the screen with your smartphone. We'll drop this link in the chat and remind folks again in the audience when we get to Q&A about where to go. We can't guarantee that we'll be able to address every question, but we'll try to get to as many as possible. For those who would like to view the program with closed captions, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming events include Paige Harden on why DNA matters, Bill Schutz's Natural History of the Heart, and Susan Orlean on our relationships with animals. Visit our website to join our email list and get the latest updates as more programs are added throughout the season. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. As part of our Arno G. Matulski Science and Town Green series, this event is supported by the Hugh and Jane Ferguson Foundation, Microsoft, and Wincode Foundation Northwest. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. If you share in Town Hall's vision of a community energized and empowered by considering questions of politics, science, and culture, please consider supporting us by becoming a member. You'll find membership information on our website. Lastly, you'll definitely want to dive deeper into this evening's topic by purchasing a copy of the author's book. The quickest way to do so is to visit the link in the chat below, which will take you directly to our friends at Elliott Bay Books. Martin Williams is Professor Emeritus and Adjunct Professor of Earth Sciences at the University of Adelaide. His many books include Climate Change in Deserts, Nile Waters, Saharan Sands, and the Nile Basin. His new book, When the Sahara Was Green, How Our Greatest Desert Came to Be, is the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Martin Williams.
Do I click on share screen? Okay, click on share. Right, am I audible? You can all hear me? Good, excellent. Well, first, it's thank you for the introduction, Shin, and it's a very great pleasure and an honor to be talking at the Seattle Town Hall presentation. I spent 6 very, very pleasant weeks in Seattle some years ago as a visiting professor at the University of Seattle in Washington, University of Washington in Seattle, and saw a lot of the country round about. So couldn't be a greater contrast to the Sahara. So what I'll try and do in the following slides, which I need to get to slideshow. Just bear with me while I get the arrow. There we go. First one. How do I make this bigger? Play from. Here we go. Okay. So I'll touch upon 1 or 2 aspects of the book, since obviously I can't talk about it all, but the key thing is, if you notice in this wonderful cover design, green in the background, brown in the foreground, the desert gradually becoming browner and browner. And one of the key questions is, why was the Sahara once able to support life, including crocodiles and hippos, elephants, giraffes, as I'll show you shortly? And why isn't it able to do so today? And when I first began working in the Sahara, which was the northern summer of 1962. It was like being on the moon. It was a landscape unlike any I'd ever seen before. I'd previously worked mapping glacial deposits in the southwest of Ireland, where everything was green and there wasn't a blade of grass. And there was just simply sand, rocks, dust, rocks, sands. Now, where I'm standing there in the heart of the Sahara at about 6,000 feet, those mountains you can see in the background are about 3 days' journey by camel away, so 100 kilometers or so. The dunes themselves are about 200 to 300 feet high. And the question is, what brought about this change? And I want you to note the red dot there, which is a small mountain called Adrabus in the heart of the Sahara. And if you draw a circle of radius 1,500 kilometers, you would only just touch the Mediterranean coast in the north and the Atlantic coast in the south. And yet, as we'll see, people were herding cattle here 5,000 years ago. So, excuse me, there are 5 things I want to cover. We'll have a quick look at the Sahara today. We'll consider the birth of the desert. We'll look at the evidence for alternating wet and dry climates and ask ourselves why. Then we'll, and this is the core of the talk really, look at the evidence for a recently wetter past when people were hunting hippos and herding cattle. And then the key question is, what caused the drying out of the Sahara and the migrations away from the desert? Was it humans or climate or both? Excuse me. Now, this is, I guess, everyone's notion of what the Sahara might look like, although in fact it's got a few more trees than we'd expect. We tend to think of sand dunes. In fact, only about 1/5 of the Sahara is covered in sand. Where does the sand come from? Well, it comes from prolonged erosion over millions of years of much older rocks, particularly the ancient sandstones that today cover over 2/3 of the Sahara. And most of the Sahara today, in fact, consists of quite rugged mountains, vast sandstone plateaus, and great tracts of gravel plains. So here's one such mountain with a great fault running down one side. These are the sort of gravel plains that people used to walk across when they were trading salt from the south up into North Africa. And you can see a little bit of a mountain poking out and mountains in the distance. What you're looking at here, in fact, is the core of an ancient volcano, where simply the core is left, with these great plugs of lava that solidified, and the rest of the volcano has been completely eroded away. And the Hogar Mountains in southern Algeria are just a series of rugged volcanic uplands. And there you can see a rather poignant building that was built at the turn of last century by Charles de Foucauld, who was a former French colonial cavalry officer who became a priest and a hermit. And he learnt, he spoke fluent Tamashek, the language of the Tuareg. He was revered by the local Tuareg. He used to help doctoring the children. And he was finally killed in 1916 by a group of Senussi fanatics from Libya. This was a rainstorm that I witnessed in the desert of Mauritania in 2004. And these sorts of rainstorms over many millions of years have helped to replenish the water table, the groundwater supplies, but they don't do much. So you can again see this wonderful field of dunes. And about a day and a half's journey away from those dunes, you're on a stony gravel plain, and all of a sudden, here's this wonderful oasis with springs coming out, palm trees, fresh water. And if you didn't know it was there, you could walk straight past it and never see it. So let's look at the birth of the Sahara. Well, the very first thing to say is that the Sahara actually came into being about 7 million years ago. This is a time of prolonged global cooling. And since that time, the climate has alternated between wet and dry. The other thing is that Africa, or the African tectonic plate, as we refer to it, was moving northwards at about 5 centimeters a year into dry tropical latitudes. And to the north of Africa, there was a great sea that extended all the way across to India. And this sea was shrinking. It's called the Tethys Sea. And as it dwindled, it deprived the northern Sahara of a major source of moist air. And at the same time, around about 6 to 7 million years ago, the surrounding oceans were becoming colder and colder. So there was less evaporation and less moisture available to bring rain to the Sahara. Incidentally, that's a dry lake bed in the eastern Sahara. You can see the cracks in the old lake floor deposit, and you can see sand between the cracks. Now, going back 420 million years, what you can see here, there is the equator, where my arrow is pointing, and there was a supercontinent consisting of South America, Africa, Antarctica, and India, all joined together. These areas that say craton means a chunk of very old rocks that have been very stable for hundreds of millions of years. And the grey shows the present continents. So at that time, 420 million years ago, Africa was part of this huge continent called Gondwana and was beginning to move north and beginning to break apart. So by 60 million years ago, so we've gone rather rapidly, you can see mid-ocean ridges picking up. These were detected by geologists from Lamont during and after the war, these mid-ocean ridges with submarine mapping. But what I want you to notice is that the equator at that time was running right through what's now the Sahara. So this was all covered in equatorial rainforest. Antarctica had split away, South America had split away, the Atlantic was opening up. India had broken off from Australia and was moving north towards Eurasia. And this progressive northward movement of Africa brought it into latitudes which today are very dry. So we can say the Sahara is dry because it's today located in latitudes where the air is subsiding and descending, dry air, and it's located well away from the influence of moist air masses. So there are very sound geographical reasons why the Sahara is dry, nothing whatsoever to do with any human impact. Sahara originated well before the earliest hominins appeared and had nothing whatsoever to do with humans. This is a simplified sketch. The sun is directly overhead over the equator, and then it appears to move north and south in the northern southern summer. The air rises, cools, vapor condenses, rain falls. So this is the wet zone, the intertropical convergence zone. The air moving north is drier progressively, sheds its moisture, and then descends. And it's a bit like pumping up a bicycle tire. The air inside becomes warmer, and when it subsides over the tropical latitudes, north and south, it acts like a gigantic desiccator. So that maintains the Sahara and the Australian deserts, the Atacama, the deserts right across through Iran, Afghanistan, across into Pakistan and India as dry tropical deserts. Again, nothing to do with humans. Now, an intriguing feature of the Sahara, these great uplands, which are volcanic, Tibesti, the Hogar that you saw in the earlier slides, Jebel Mara in Western Sudan. You can see these are aligned, and the Cameroon Mountains running north. And what controls the location of these mountains, in fact, are zones of weakness in the crust that have been reactivated. Now, during wetter phases, from at least 20 million years ago onwards, huge rivers flowed down from these mountains, carrying a load of sand and gravel across the Sahara to the sea, to the Mediterranean, and down to the Atlantic. And the sand carried by those rivers was later reworked by wind to eventually form the great sand dunes. That shows these great zones of weakness in the old rocks in the crust. There's one lot here and another lot there. And where they intersect, you get volcanoes forming. So Jebel Mara, Tibesti, and the Hogar. So these ancient rocks continue to play a role in the topography of the Sahara, the uplands and the depressions. Now, I mentioned the fact that over the last 20 million years or more, and particularly in the last 7 million, there have been these alternating wet and dry cycles. So what's the reason for that? Well, at the present time, and for millions and millions of years, of course, the Earth has been traveling around the sun, and the path it follows is not a circle, it's an elliptical. And it's sometimes more elliptical and sometimes less, so that it's on occasions furthest from the sun. In addition, the tilt of the Earth's axis has varied through time. If it was vertical, if there were no tilt, we wouldn't have any seasons. We wouldn't have summer or winter. The greater the tilt, the greater the seasonality on the Earth. And then if you've ever played with a child's spinning top, which I love to do with my grandchildren, then you see that the spin varies slightly. So you've got 3 different cycles, orbital cycles, we refer to them. That's simply the path of the Earth. The eccentricity cycle, that's around the sun, has roughly 100,000 years. The tilt of the Earth's axis, the changes in the cycle from the greatest tilt to the minimum tilt, about 40,000 years. The season of the year in which the Earth is closest to the sun is roughly 20,000 years on average. So, combining those two, when the tropics receive more radiation from the sun, the wet season lasts longer, the monsoon is stronger, rainstorms was more intense, and the summer rains pushed further into the Sahara. Equally, when the tropics receive less solar radiation, you have a shorter wet season, a weaker monsoon, less intense rainstorms, and the summer rains don't extend very far into the Sahara. And that, in essence, is what controls this distribution of wet and dry phases over time. Here you can see the sun, the Earth when it's closest to the sun, when it's furthest from the sun, the tilt of the axis varying, and the wobble. So if we just now look at a single cycle from what we call the last interglacial, which was the last time it was really warm and wet throughout the Earth, and sea level was about 5 to 8 meters higher than today, which I've called A, that's 125,000 years ago. What you can see is the sea level has fluctuated with a periodicity of roughly 20,000 years, down to a very low level, 125 meters below present sea level, which was the last glacial maximum, when the whole of Mount Rainier was covered in ice. In fact, Chicago was under about 2.5 miles of ice, and the whole of North America virtually was covered in a great ice cap. And then the ice melted fairly quickly and reached its present level about 7,000 years ago. And this cyclicity has been repeated again and again in the last few million years. Some of the evidence for this is this slightly complicated diagram, but I'll explain it. The present limit of active dunes coincides very roughly with about the 150 millimeter rainfall isohyet, zones of equal rain. And the limit of fixed dunes, which is this dashed line here, extends right down to areas that, in some cases, now get a meter of rain a year. That's a lot of rain. So on occasions in the past, when it was much drier, the whole of the Sahara has expanded by about 800, 1,000 kilometers to the south and to the north. And dunes that were previously vegetated and stable were then reactivated. Now I want to look at the evidence of a recently wetter past, which is between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago. It wasn't uniformly wet all that time. There were times when it was a bit drier. But let's look at some of the evidence that allows people like me, geologists, scientists, and archaeologists, to reconstruct what was going on. This is in the Eastern Sahara, and those deposits are the floor of an ancient lake. All the surrounding shoreline of the lake has been blown away by the wind, and now the highest points in the landscape are what were once the lowest points, the floor of the ancient lake, with the vehicle and the person there for scale person. Not far from that area, we found the fossil remains of a Nile perch. Those are the vertebra, and that's the mouth portion. About 9,000 years old, very much wetter then, 200 or 300 kilometers from the river, and something like six foot long, a couple of meters long, a big fish. There were rivers flowing, and they've been detected using radar, and they're now partially buried beneath the sand. Here you can see a couple of interesting, there's a very high dune there. These are old floodplains of rivers. There's a small one here, and on the surface of this lower one, there was Neolithic pottery, 5,000 years old. And on the surface of the upper one, which was very fine silt and clay, you had late Stone Age tools. Today, the river seldom flows, and it's sand and gravel. So that's telling us that in the past, huge river flowed down between these dunes and the mountains further away. At the border between Egypt, Sudan, and Libya, there's a mountain called Jebel Yuwaynat. In Arabic, it means the mountain of the little springs. There are 3 permanent freshwater springs there. It's quite a high mountain. And you see these wonderful paintings. There are well over 1,000 galleries of painting. You can see cattle and the herders, little cattle camp, another person, a herder. Sometimes you see dogs. So on occasions you see camps with women and children, and occasionally you see hunting scenes. Now, 2,000 or 3,000 kilometers away, and at this time the tropics were warmer and wetter, the Sahara was now covered in what we call savanna, woodland, and grassland, a bit like East Africa today. And this lasted until 5,000 years ago, when the tropics again became cooler and drier, and the Sahara once again became desert. But what you can see is women wearing their finery, riding oxen, and sometimes little tents and with babies. Now that's very interesting, because today in Western Sudan, when the rains return in the wet season, the Bagara people migrate north in search of pasture, and they migrate with the women and the children, the babies, riding cattle, riding oxen. These paintings are 5,000 or 6,000 years old, and there's a tradition that still persists until today. Now I'll show you a couple more bits of the rock art. I've no idea what these figures are, so I've called them mythical figures. This is right down in the southern Libyan desert, and they appear to be boxing or sparring. Then we can recognize giraffe engraved in the rocks with a local chap for scale, and elephants with a tiny little figure, probably more recent, with a throwing stick of some sort. The elephant engraved here. These elephants were engraved about 12,000, 15,000 years ago. Antelopes, and some younger figures over here. 2 antelopes, one there and one there. And now I'll take you on a journey to Adrabus to show you the sort of evidence we saw as we traveled by camel and on foot on the way to the desert. Our guide was local Tuareg, Zoe Benweni. My camel is the one in the middle. And that was our destination, Adrabus, which today is completely waterless, uninhabited, no people there. On the way, it was a 3-day journey. Professor Desmond Clark from Berkeley spotted the top of a pot being blasted by the wind. Zoe was fascinated. He thought we were looking for gold. And it turned out that the pot itself was a cover for a much more decorated pot underneath. And the pot underneath, which you can see here, which is about 5,000 years old, was full of the dried fruit of the Celtis integrifolia tree, which today needs about 0.5 meter of rain a year to thrive. So this was immediately telling us that it was wetter when this pot was made. The very first day that Desmond and I arrived at Adrabus, just as the sun was rising, we saw a little spot of white poking out of the clay, which we thought was a bit of bone. In fact, it turned out to be part of a horn core. And after 14 days with dental picks exhuming this creature, what you can see there is the oldest complete Neolithic domestic cow that's ever been recovered. just over 5,000 years old, Bos brachyceros, the short-horned cow. We found hand axes dating back at least 500,000 years, and a whole series of tools. You can see arrowheads, spear points, knives made out of a beautiful green silicified rock, adzes, these are somewhat older, these still the favorite tool of local carpenters building boats along the Nile, grindstones, and various cutting tools of different sorts. So there were thousands and thousands of these artifacts. Now, coming to the Exodus, about 2,500 years ago, the Hyksos invaded Egypt and introduced the horse. And the people living in southwestern Libya, the Garamantes, quickly developed the idea of using chariots for warfare. And this annoyed the Romans when they came in 2,000 years ago. So they set about fighting them. And so you can see here a horse and chariot, rather schematic, because the chariots probably had 4 wheels rather than 2. And the desiccation of the Sahara and movement of people out of the Sahara was linked to the fact that there was less solar radiation coming into the tropics and the weaker monsoon, as I said earlier, and so less rain. And although there are recurrent claims that humans created the desert, there is no compelling evidence, in my view, that humans ever caused the Sahara to become arid. Furthermore, the drying out of the Sahara coincides with the drying out of the desert areas of India and China and other parts of the world. Now, this little rock engraving is in the Aya Mountains. It's 2,000 or 1,500 years old. And what you can see are these plumed warriors with their headgear, holding on a leash small horses. Now, Eric von Daniken, some years ago, wrote a book called Chariot of the Gods, and he claimed that these were superior beings from outer space who arrived, and these are their antennae, their space helmets. To which I would ask, well, if they were superior beings, why did they need horses? So to sum up, from about 4,500 years onwards, the northern tropics received less solar radiation, less heat from the sun. Summer monsoon became weaker. The previously more humid desert regions of India and China also dried out at the same time as the Sahara. And this drier climate was a result of changes in solar radiation and was not caused by humans. And that brings my talk to an end. Thank you.
Martin, thank you so much for that presentation. That was very informative and very rich, and very lucky to be here. Thank you for being here with us tonight. We're now going to segue to the audience questions. Thank you all for submitting for Martin Williams here. My name is Faith, and I'm the house manager. And now I'm going to get to your questions. Let's start with this one. It says, I had learned at uni that at least the Sahel in the north of the Sahara had been deforested by the Roman Empire, spreading the desert further. Is this idea now debunked?
Not entirely. When the Romans moved in, all the coastal valleys in North Africa were actually eroding and cutting down. And what the Romans did very cleverly is they built a series of porous dams across these coastal rivers. And the dams trapped silt and clay and also moisture. So they were then able to grow olive trees, wheat, barley, and it was slightly wetter at that time. So the Romans benefited from the fact that it was wetter. They didn't actually cause the desiccation. The drying out also was caused by factors beyond human control. Part of these multiple cycles, it's like big fleas have little fleas upon their backs to bite them, and little fleas have littler fleas, and so ad infinitum. You've got a series of climatic cycles. So I don't think we can blame the Romans. And I don't think, but if you come to later times, more recent times, certainly it's true that some of the colonial people in North Africa, when they tried to interfere with the traditional nomadic way of life and substitute plantations of single trees, substitute monoculture for sort of shifting agriculture, that then certainly did trigger a wave of accelerated erosion.
Wonderful. I'm now going to take you back a couple years, Martin, if that's okay. But the question is, how old were you when you found your passion for the desert? What were your first steps into this passion?
I was 21 years old. I had just graduated. I'd received a phone call from one of my lecturers saying, would I like to join a British Army expedition to the southern Libyan desert in the summer? And I agreed. I asked, well, what do I need to do? And he simply said everything. So I went along, and I had air photographs. I had ancient World War II maps, which were completely useless. And I mapped the geology, I mapped the landforms, worked on the archaeology, and that triggered off a passion for the desert. Because what intrigued me was there was so much evidence of a former human presence. You could find little ostrich eggshell beads. You could find fish bones. You could see this beautiful rock art. You could find stone tools of different ages. So it was quite obvious that this now totally arid wilderness had once been occupied by humans. So that prompted the curiosity of this 21-year-old young man to say, well, why was it once wet? How is it possible? What was going on? Why isn't it wet today? What happened?
So it was the curiosity that got you out there.
Yeah, that led me on a journey. 50 years later, 60 years later, I'm still asking those questions.
Yeah.
We've got some pretty good answers now.
Did you ever expect to go out there in your lifetime? Did you ever think about it?
Think about
going to the Sahara, going to the desert.
When I was about 9 years old, we were living in France, and I came across a beautifully illustrated article by a French geographer called the Dead Valleys of the Sahara, Les Vallées Mortes du Sahara. And that intrigued me, and I thought I'd love to go and see those. So by the time I was about 10 or 11, this embryonic seed had been planted in my mind, in my brain, that one day I wanted to go and see for myself. Was it true?
Yeah, it was bound to happen for you. You were born.
Maybe.
You were born for it. I know you were.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes, the next question is, how do you determine the age of a rock?
Of a rock, or of a fossil, or of a pot?
The question is of a rock, but I'll let you take it where you want to go.
Yeah. Okay, I'll begin first with looking at the age of, say, a fireplace, where you've got charcoal. Now, all living creatures, plants, animals, breathe in air from the atmosphere. And in the air we breathe in, there's a little bit of radioactive carbon, which we call carbon-14, tiny amount. And when we die, that carbon starts to decay. And it decays at a very slow rate. But by measuring the proportion of, if you like, still active carbon to dead carbon in a sample of bone or tooth or wood, charcoal, then you can go back about 50,000 years. Now, if you're trying to date a sand dune, there's a very clever technique that my wife worked on for many years, which is you can actually date the last time a grain of sand was exposed to sunlight before it was buried. And that's called luminescence dating. I won't explain the details. I mentioned in the book very briefly, but that can take you back 200,000 or 300,000 years, maybe back a million years if you're lucky. All rocks, or most rocks anyway, contain some radioactive elements, and those radioactive elements decay. So the parent is radioactive, the daughter is stable, as one hopes daughters will be, and you then measure the ratio of the parent to the daughter, or the, if you like, the radioactive to the no longer radioactive. And in the case of very old rocks, you can go back thousands of millions of years. So depending on the type of rock and what you're actually dating, you can date volcanic rocks, looking at the potassium and the argon. Okay, so I've dealt with rocks, I've dealt with archaeological remains. Have I answered the question?
I think so. I mean, I feel satisfied. But if you have anything else to say on that, yeah, I think you're good.
Chapter 2 in the book goes
Yeah.
into that.
Okay.
Explains a bit of it in non-technical terms.
Even more incentive for the viewers at home to buy the book. Check out the chapter. Here's our next question. It says, do you know where the name Gondwana came from for the former supercontinent?
Yes, the Gonds were a tribal people in India, and early geologists last century discovered a particular fossil type of fern, which they found in that part of India, and they also found it in South America, they found it in Australia, they found it in Antarctica. And they realized when they reconstructed the positions of the continents that they'd all been at about the similar latitude, and that similar fossils as well as similar covers of ice. So they used the word Gond from the Gond people in India, a very ancient people, and simply called it Gondwana or Gondwana land. So that's how the name arose, just from some imaginative geologist.
Yeah.
To be a geologist, you have to be imaginative.
Of course, that's part of the job.
Part of the job.
Have you ever created any names yourself or wanted to patent something of your own?
We did give a couple of names to two very big sandstone plateaus in southeast Libya. We called one of them the Hamad el Akdamin and the other the Hamad el Fayud, which means the plateau of the guests and the plateau of the ancient ones. The ancient ones being the prehistoric peoples. And a little later, an Italian colleague who was a petroleum geologist found a third plateau, which he named the Hamada, which means the plateau. Ibn Battuta was the greatest desert traveler of all time, medieval traveler. He covered something like 30,000 miles in his lifetime, went everywhere, came back, survived, and wrote about it at great length. So, yeah.
Yeah. Our next question is, as stated in your book, dinosaurs roamed the area when it was characterized by rivers, lakes, swamps, wetlands, and lots of edible growth everywhere. The Sahara wasn't always a desert, but now that it is, what is its purpose?
What is
What is its purpose, is what the question says.
what is the purpose of a desert?
Yeah.
Okay, well, the dinosaurs were wandering around between about 200 million years ago and about 66 million years ago when they became extinct.
Mhm.
Um, People live in the desert today, animals, plants. There's a lot of water. Most of it's below ground. Some of it's quite close to the surface. I think the purpose of a desert, if it has to have a purpose,
Mhm.
is to show that by being clever and adapting to the local conditions, you can make a good living.
Mm.
You can become part of the landscape. So, years ago, English philosopher called Francis Bacon said um, in Latin, but I'll put it into English, nature to be managed must be obeyed. You need to understand the laws of nature.
Mm.
So, three things are essential for life: water, air, plants. And
Those are all essential things.
we have to look after all three.
Mhm. Yeah. How did you start writing this book? What have you been writing it for years? Was it something that you said, I want to write this book now? Because you have a good repertoire of books that you've written.
I it, one morning after I'd walked the dog and fed the cat and so on,
Mhm.
um, I thought I'd love to put down in an interesting sort of way, exciting way, what it was like to experience such a very different environment and how archaeologists reconstruct the past, how geologists and soil scientists can assist in this process, how people have survived and adapted. Because fundamentally, when there's a major big change, either climate change or something else, you've got three options. You can adapt, you can migrate, or you can become extinct.
Mhm.
And that's it. So I just sat down and wrote it and wrote two or three chapters, gave them to my toughest critic, my wife, who is always very sweet, says, well, don't you think this bit should be left out? And don't you think that should have come first? And anyway, I'll spare you those details. And I sent it off to my publisher at Cambridge University Press, who'd published a couple of my bigger books earlier. And they said, no, this is a popular book. We don't publish popular stuff, you know. And they suggested a wonderful editor with Princeton University Press,
Mhm.
Ingrid Nerlich, and she made some very sensible suggestions. It went out in draft form, the outline and so on, to three reviewers. They all wanted it written their way, of course, so
Of course.
you have to stick up for yourself.
Mhm.
And then the actual writing took about a year, and then making the changes and all the fiddly bits that come afterwards took about another year.
Oh, wow.
Normally, when I'm writing a book, I allow about a month a chapter
Oh, that's a good goal.
and start work early and write when I'm fresh. And I just write it out. And then I wait till early the following morning and reread it and think, goodness, this is terrible.
Yeah,
And that's the process. It's a
yeah.
discipline. It's a discipline. And you do not wait until you feel inspired.
Mm.
And there's a lot of research involved. For this book, I probably read well over 1,000 items
Wow.
in different languages.
Mhm.
Um, but don't forget, I've been working on this topic and in this in North Africa and Sahara generally for a very long time,
Hmm.
on and off.
So it's
So,
always in there. It's always ready to go on the page.
oh, well, there are catastrophes. I mean, I used an old memory stick to
Mm.
save the first 3 or 4 chapters, and it was a faulty one. So
Oh, not a faulty memory stick.
I lost 3 months of work.
Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry.
So just start again.
Yeah. Did you feel that when you turned it into the publishers that you got pushback on things that you really wouldn't budge on? What is essential in this book that you needed to have?
My own voice.
Mm,
At one stage, in the nicest possible way, it was suggested that it should be polished,
mm,
use a professional polisher to make it accessible to the great North American public.
mhm,
And I said, well, let's have a go at one chapter. And she did a wonderful job, but it wasn't me.
yeah.
It wasn't my style. And anyone who knows me knows my style.
Mhm.
You can criticize what I wear, you can criticize the way I talk, but you cannot criticize my style.
Yeah, that's right.
That's me.
Yeah, I think tone is very important, especially teaching one something. They can really absorb who you are through your book.
Yeah.
So I'm glad
And
you didn't budge on that.
I didn't. And of course, the other thing is that I write in a way as I would talk,
Hmm.
as if I was telling a story or explaining it. And so it has to come across as something that can be narrated.
Hmm.
In fact, they made an audio book out of it, which I thought was not possible, but they did. And it's very, very good. I was amazed.
Did they carry yourself through someone else's voice well, do you think?
I was given a choice between a wonderful North American voice
Hmm.
and an equally wonderful UK voice.
Hmm.
And I thought, well, since I'm the narrator and I don't have a North American voice,
Hmm.
better go for the UK voice. And he did a very good job.
Good. You got to have that match, I think.
Yes.
Yes, it's just 1 degree closer to the actual author, I
Yeah,
think.
that's right.
Yeah.
He did a better job than I would have done because I would have been spluttering and coughing and sneezing.
It's all natural. It's all natural. What do you think was the most surprising or unexpected thing you encountered while writing this? Because you've been involved with this research since you were 21, as you said. So was it expected what you wrote? Was there anything that you didn't necessarily know before?
um, One of the very intriguing things was the fact that the whole of the Sahara, apart from a few mountainous areas, was covered by the sea.
Hmm.
The sea invaded. And this was a few 100 million years back, but this was a worldwide event.
Hmm.
And that mountain I showed you early on in the talk, if you climb to the top of that, you find deposits of marine sediment, a couple of 100 million years old, that have been uplifted about over 1,000 meters. So rereading the early work on that brought home to me that the Sahara really on occasions has been incredibly active, with earthquakes and uplift and volcanic activity.
Yeah.
And that little volcano, or the big volcano, Jebel Mara in Western Sudan, very, very arid. And when we went there, quite an epic trip because we climbed down into the volcanic caldera down the cliff, and the water was pretty awful.
Yeah.
And we found on the flanks of the volcano fossilized leaves of oil palm, which today are sort of West African coastal plants.
Hmm.
So that it was 1 million years ago, it was very much wetter. So it was constantly this evidence of previously wetter events. And in the Aya Mountains, as I mentioned in the book, you come across rather pathetically a group of baboons and a group of monkeys that were originally from West Africa and made their way along the former river valleys up into the mountains. And when the rivers dried out, they were abandoned and they stayed in the mountains.
Wow. Why do you think they stayed in, or why did they stay in the mountains?
Sorry?
Why did they stay in the mountains?
They had no choice.
Uh-huh.
The mountains were got a bit of rain because they were high, and the desert they couldn't cross because there was no food and no water. So they were stuck.
Wow. Well, I mean that's why they stayed. They had no choice to go. Yeah. What are
Nowhere
you
else to
gonna
go.
do?
Yeah.
Now that we're reaching the end of our night, I wanna end on this. But what do you want the audience to take away from this book, and how is this book new and different from other books on the Sahara, or new information that you feel you could convey to others that others couldn't maybe?
Two things. First, don't blame ourselves for everything. Um, in the case of these great deserts, they have nothing to do with humans and destructive humans. We do enough damage as it is. Don't need to be blamed for things we don't do.
Sure.
And secondly, optimistically, looking at the way humans, plants, animals have adapted to these extreme environments. So adaptation is certainly possible. You've got to be clever, you've got to be patient, you've got to be stoical, but it can be done.
That's lovely. Martin, thank you so much for being here with us tonight. This was so nice to have you, and we're very lucky that you could kind of visit us here in Seattle from Australia. That's very fun.
A great pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Yes, and to our audience at home, remember to pick up a copy from our friends over at Elliott Bay Books, and that link can be found in the chat. Everyone at home, from wherever you are, wherever home is, have a great night. Martin, thank you so much again.
I'll drink to that.
Have a great night, everyone.